Sick. A Summer to Remember by Mary Balogh. Continuing on page 198. I chose honor, he said, pressing his forehead so hard against his fist that he felt and welcomed pain. God help me. I took the chance of escape and assigned my brother the role of scapegoat. From a position high in a mountain pass, after he had broken free of the encircling trap, he had looked back to see Sid being led away captive. He had continued on his way and had completed his mission successfully. He had been highly commended afterward, mentioned in dispatches, hailed as a fearless hero. One of God's bizarre jokes. It was war, Lauren said. It was worse than war. His nightmares were clawing at his waking self. He was about to face the dreaded images quite deliberately. He was about to verbalize them to a lady who should be protected from the harsh realities of life and war, not deliberately exposed to them. But his own need to achieve some sort of catharsis overwhelmed his sense of decorum. War is a game, you see, a vicious game. If a British officer is captured in uniform, he is treated with honor and courtesy while held in captivity. If he is not in uniform, then he is treated with all the ferocity the French and the Spanish and Portuguese partisans show one another's captives. I knew that before my decision was made. He had known it. He had known it. It had been in the forefront of his mind when he had hesitated for the merest fraction of a moment before making his decision. He had known what would be facing the one of them who was caught. There had been time for only a quick bear hug. I met up with a group of partisans the same day, he continued. I could have sent them back to rescue Sid. They could have done it. They outnumbered the French. But I needed them, all of them. My damned mission had need of them. 2 weeks passed before we were finished and could find Sid and spring him free. I did not expect to find him still alive, but he lived, barely. If only memory were not such a starkly visual thing. He closed his eyes more tightly. If only it were only visual. But there were sounds and smells. Who would have guessed but in one's nightmares one could smell burned flesh? They had started on his right side, he said, and worked their way gradually downward, with exquisitely wrought tortures of burning, crushing, and gouging. They had reached his right knee before we found him. Our surgeon saved his leg, but his arm had to be amputated after we had got him back to base. That journey. He sucked in air slowly and audibly. He had given away nothing under torture, not my name or my destination or the purpose of my mission, only his own name, rank, and regiment, repeated over and over again, night and day, even after we had him back. They had not broken him, except in body. Had he broken, of course, and told them what they wanted to know, they would have granted him a swift and merciful death. He heard a soft expulsion of breath behind him, but she said nothing. I sacrificed my brother, he said, for honor, and then I had all the glory of success. I was trained, you see, to have a heart of flint, to be ruthlessly opportunistic and selfish in the accomplishment of my duties. I sacrificed my brother, and then I brought him home and created mayhem here with the lives and sensibilities of the rest of my family. I behaved badly that summer, Lauren. Shamefully. It is a good thing you have insisted upon a temporary betrothal. I would not be a good lifelong bargain. I amputated myself, you see, in exchange for becoming a glorious hero. There is nothing of me left. He laughed softly. Nothing but honor. He is alive, she said. His sensible matter-of-fact Lauren. Kiss. He is alive. He breathes. He spoke harshly. He is not alive, Lauren. He will never be that again. He is my father's steward here, for God's sake. He plans to accept the salaried position of steward on one of Bewcastle's properties. You do not understand, of course, the dreadful nature of such a fate. How could you? Sydenham was an artist. He is an artist. His landscape paintings were the most extraordinary canvases I have ever seen. There was craftsmanship there, and an eye for color and atmosphere and detail. And, how can an ordinary mortal like me describe the soul that was there? His painting breathed with what even a layman like me could sense was the very meaning of the scene he depicted. He was a gentleman and a dreamer and a visionary and now he is serving a life sentence inside the prison of a ruined body, capable of nothing loftier than being someone's steward. Kid, she said, you must not do this to yourself, dear. It was war, and you did what was right. You made the right decision. You did your duty. It was what you had to do. How could it be right, he cried, when I see him so maimed and starred, when I see my sweet-natured Sid shut up deep inside himself, rejecting my every overture of sympathy, hating me? How can I believe that what I did was right? It just was, she said. Some things have no neat explanation, kid. Life is not like that, unfortunately. One can spend all of one's life doing the right things and going unrewarded in the end. One can find oneself forced into making a choice between two courses that seem equally right, but only one can be chosen. You made the right choice. A part of him knew with the utmost certainty that if he had the choice to make over again, he would take the same course and suffer the same hell of remorse and guilt afterward. I could not love thee, dear, so much. Loved I not honor more, he said quietly. Who wrote those lines? Do you know? Richard Lovelace, I believe, she said, one of the Cavalier poets. Never believe it, he said. It is a lie. Nothing should come before love. If you had made the other choice, she said after a short silence, filled with the howling of the wind and the lashing of the rain, and if hundreds, perhaps thousands, had suffered as a result, kid, you would never have forgiven yourself. He laughed softly. I would not have needed to. I would be dead. You did your duty, she said softly. It is all any of us can do, kid. He kept his eyes closed and his forehead pressed to his fist. He allowed her words to envelop him, to soothe him, to comfort him, very much, for the moment at least, like absolution. For the past several minutes, Lauren had been feeling very much as if she were going to faint. She had always tried to avoid any sight or mention of violence, believing that ladies should have no dealings with such sordid reality. It had never been particularly difficult to do. Most gentlemen seemed to hold the same belief. She could remember an occasion when Lily, newly come to Newbury, had launched eagerly into a conversation about the wars. She had grown up in the train of the armies, first in India, then in the Peninsula, as the supposed daughter of an infantry sergeant. Lauren, consumed by secret hatred at the time, had tried to appease her conscience by instructing Lily in what would be expected of her as the Countess of Kilbourne. She could recall advising Lily that a lady did not speak of the wars or listen to any conversation about them. She had been so very righteous in those days, so convinced that she was right, so much the perfect lady, so unbearably prim. But now she could not shake from her mind the horrifying images of torture that Kit had conjured up, though he had given no details, or the image of the regimental surgeon plying his trade, saw in hand, amputating a man's arm. She could almost smell the blood. At one point, she had considered trying to change the subject, as she had done so successfully last night. But the two occasions, so similar on the surface, were in fact entirely different. Tonight, the unfortunate incident in the drawing-room with Sydenham Butler had ripped away everything he had put there to cover the gaping wound of his deepest agony. Tonight, It would have been cruel, unthinkable, unpardonable to have tried to stop him. Tonight he had needed to unburden his conscience more, perhaps, than he had needed anything else in his life before. And so she had sat straight and still on the white velvet bench, her feet neatly side by side on the floor, her hands clasping the ends of her shawl, determinedly clinging to consciousness, biting the ringing in her ears, the coldness in her hand. The fact that she was a delicately, correctly nurtured lady was of no significance. She had resisted the urge to shift the focus of her hearing to the wind and the rain outside. She had listened carefully to every single word. She had not cringed or allowed herself to faint. She knew what it felt like to lock up everything that was most painful inside oneself, not sharing one's hurt, even with one's dearest friend. She knew all about pain and loneliness, and even despair. Perhaps that was why he had chosen her as his audience, even if it had not been a conscious choice. Perhaps he simply recognized in her a fellow sufferer. There was no doubt that he had done what was right. She had told him that, and of course he must know it for himself. But she realized, too, that knowing it would not really ease his pain. She knew he would never forgive himself for not doing the wrong thing. It was pointless to add words to words. She sat quietly and waited, giving him all the time he needed. She was glad he had locked the gallery door behind them. There was no danger of anyone rushing in before he was ready to face the world again. After a while, when she sensed somehow that the time was right, she got to her feet without speaking and closed the distance between them. She set her arms about his waist from behind and rested her cheek against his shoulder, intent upon giving him all the comfort of her physical presence, but what it was worth. She felt him inhale slowly and deeply. She both felt and heard the breath shudder out of him. And then he turned and caught her to him, crushing her against him with arms that felt like iron bands. She felt all the breath rush out of her, but it did not occur to her to feel alarm or to struggle to be free. He needed her. Plainly and simply stated, he needed her, and it did not occur to her for a single moment to resist his need. When his mouth found hers, it was hard and urgent, grinding her lips against her teeth, bruising them, pressing them apart. His tongue plunged deep into her mouth. One of his hands, spread over her lower back, jerked her hard against him, leaving her in no doubt of the sexual turn his need had taken. She felt curiously detached. The part of her that was the Lauren Edgeworth's perfect lady stood some distance away, coolly analyzing, admonishing her with the reminder that this was the inevitable consequence of all the impropriety that had characterized her dealings with him from the very start, from the very moment she had looked back over her shoulder at him in Hyde Park. This was the consequence of being repeatedly alone with him, having deceived her family and his into allowing it on the assumption that they were betrothed. This was the sort of unbridled, dangerous passion one must expect to be unleashed by the unseemly talk of violence she had allowed when they were alone together behind locked doors. This had to be stopped right now. The other, less familiar, formerly unsuspected part of herself that had been born at Vauxhall, or perhaps much earlier than that, in the park, stayed present in his arms and recognized that she was a woman, that he had need of her, that she had warmth and femininity and humanity to offer him in his need, and the freedom to give all if she chose. Choices again. Until recently, until now, choices had never been difficult. She had always known, by the rigid code of gentility, what was right. She had never known the code of the heart. Honor or love, they were opposed, as they had been for him. But this time it was love that could and should triumph. She chose love, though she did not perhaps use that word to herself, since her thoughts were not verbal ones. This, she thought quite clearly, this was what she had meant at Vauxhall. She knew it with a sudden blinding intuition. This was what she had meant, this coming alive to the woman who had been locked away all her life inside the lady who was Lauren Edgeworth. His mouth was against her throat, on her shoulders, at her breasts. His hands were moving urgently against the flimsy fabric of her evening gown, pushing it off her shoulders and down her arms, exposing her breasts. She did not flinch, even though there were both firelight and candlelight to make her feel doubly exposed. She was a woman, and he needed her. She would give, then. She needed too. She needed to be a woman. She shivered with mingled fright and excitement as his mouth closed warmly over one breast and suckled her, his tongue slicking over her nipple and suffusing her from head to toe in raw desire. She cupped a hand with infinite gentleness over the back of his head and set a cheek against his soft, fair hair. He moved his head to set his forehead against her shoulder. "Stop me," he said, his voice both rough and husky. "For God's sake, Lauren, stop me." "No." She lifted his head with both hands and looked into his face, her fingers gently stroking through his hair. "This is what I choose, kid. What I freely choose. Don't stop. Please don't stop." She could not bear it now as he did. "This is not just for you. It is for me, too." She feathered light kisses over his face as she spoke, kissing his cheeks, his eyes, his mouth. He was holding her again then, just as close, and kissing her just as deeply as before, except that the frenzied urgency had gone, to be replaced by hot passion mingled with what felt very like tenderness. As if she had become for him not just a woman, but Lauren too. Her naked breasts pressed against his coat. She was giver and gift. He was gift and giver. It was upon one of the velvet benches that he laid her down after another minute or two. It was quite wide enough to make a narrow bed, she realized. She reached up her arms for him, but he was raising her down to her waist, removing her silk slippers, her stockings, and her undergarments, unbuttoning the front flap of his breeches. His eyes, heavy-lidded with desire, roamed over her. His hair was disheveled, his cheeks flushed. He looked beautiful beyond belief. Lauren Edgeworth, that disciplined lady, stood apart again for a moment and informed her other self that she was simply not thinking, that she would forever regret what would happen unless she put a stop to it now. But the point was that she was thinking. This was not mindless passion. It was not even passion, in fact. It was something more primal, more deeply emotional than that. It was something she knew with absolute certainty she would never regret. He knelt beside the bench, kissing her face with light feathering kisses. With his hands he fondled her, doing exquisite things with her breasts, holding them, stroking them, rolling the hardened tender nipples between thumbs and forefingers. And then, with one hand, he fondled her there, its fingers nimbly probing her naked flesh, passing folds, stroking, lightly scratching, pulsing, finding the most intimate part of her and sliding inward. She closed her eyes and inhaled slowly. She knew what happened between a man and a woman, and Clara had explained it to her before her planned wedding to Neville. She had sometimes tried to imagine it, though more often she had tried not to. It must be embarrassing, utterly distasteful, she had always thought. She had imagined it as a purely carnal thing, totally stripped of emotion or even of any tactile sensation, apart from the humiliating penetration of her body that must occur. She had never suspected that there would be this ache, this yearning, this eagerness to be penetrated, to be joined, this need, emotional as well as physical, to give and to be gifted. What this passion? If so, it was not mindless at all. Lauren, his mouth was warm over hers, it is not too late to stop me. Don't stop." She did not open her eyes. "Kid." He had removed his coat and waistcoat. His shirt felt warm and silky against her naked breasts. So did his breeches against her inner thighs as he pushed between them and spread them wide. His weight bore her down into the velvet cushions of the bench. It made her feel more defenseless, on the verge of alarm, open and vulnerable, and pulsing with a heightened need that was almost unbearable. She felt him then, pressed against the place where his finger had been just moments before, but much thicker, harder. She breathed in slowly as he came inside her, slowly stretching her, filling her with a terrifying sort of exultation. There was no going back now, no stopping him. It was too late, and she was glad it was too late. She gripped his shoulders and concentrated upon not showing either fear or pain. There was pain. There was no more room. He was going to hurt her, but she had been told it would hurt. Then something tore inside her, something that for a moment threatened unbearable pain, and then was gone, just as the barrier of her virginity was gone. He pushed deep. "Lauren," he murmured against her ear. "Sweet, so very sweet. Have I hurt you?" "No." Her voice sounded shockingly normal. She should lie still and relaxed, and Clara had advised, until her husband had finished. Her husband. Finished? Had he finished now? He drew out of her, and she felt a pang of regret. This was all? Once in a lifetime, and it was over already, to be relived only in dreams for the rest of her life? Over so soon? But at the moment she expected him to withdraw altogether, he pushed back inward. There was soreness. There was also an exquisite silken feeling, and the knowledge that there were to be a few moments longer. She wanted to beg him to do it again, but even at such a moment she knew a lady's reluctance to appear gauche or to make foolish demands. He did it again, and again. She lay still, holding his shoulders as if they were the only anchor of her existence, quietly absorbing all the forbidden delights of her shocking fall from virtue. She was glad. What reward had virtue ever brought her? Virtue was its own reward, she had always believed. But it was not. Virtue was no reward at all. Did he know how good it made her feel, this repeated thrust and withdrawal, which had become smooth and rhythmic? Did he know? Was that why he did it? To delight her? But she could hear his labored breathing, and she could feel his increased body heat. And she knew that of course he did it because it delighted him. She delighted him. She delighted him. She, Lauren Edgeworth. She smiled and focused all her thoughts, all her feelings downward. She would drink this cup of pleasure to the very dregs. The memory would last her a lifetime. His hands slid beneath her before she was more than halfway down the cup, holding her buttocks firm, tilting her upward, and his thrusts became harder, faster, deeper. A sharp ache of pure pleasure came swirling upward through her belly to focus in her breasts, but before it could be repeated, far too soon it seemed, how greedy she was. He strained deep into her, and she felt a warm liquid gush. Ah, he was finished, and she was not. Did women ever finish? Did they ever begin? Was there only the delight and the reaching for something beyond one's graft? But the delight was enough. She was not sorry. She would never be sorry. She would not allow her conscience to scold her later tonight, tomorrow, for the rest of her life. She was glad this had happened. It had been one of the loveliest experiences of her life. No, it was the loveliest. She thought he must have fallen asleep for a few minutes. She ran her fingers through his hair and turned her head to gaze into the fire, which was sending crackling sparks up the chimney as the logs burned down. She listened to the cozy sound of rain against the window. He said after a while, and he lifted his head to look down at her. I do not have to say I am sorry, do I, Lauren? I did not force. She set the fingers of one hand over his mouth. "You know you did not," she said. "I will not be on your conscience, Kit." He smiled, a sleepy, warm smile. "I will say thank you instead, then," he said. "Thank you, Lauren, for such a precious gift. Was it very painful? I have heard it is so the first time." "It was not very," she assured him. He lifted himself off her then and stood up to adjust his clothing, his back to her. He held his handkerchiefs out to her without turning. "Use this," he said. She had been wondering how she would manage. There was blood, she discovered, but even now, though her hand shook as she cleansed herself, she could not bring herself to a full realization of the enormity of what she had done. That came only after she had put herself to rights and was sitting on the edge of the bench, all neat and respectable again, the soiled handkerchief balled in one hand. "Well," Kit said, turning and smiling cheerfully at her, "we are going to have to decide upon a wedding date, aren't we?" 16. The rain stopped during the night, though it was the middle of the morning before the sun shone and dried the grass and promised summer heat for the afternoon. Kit suggested and organized the game of cricket, out on the long front lawn. It was intended originally just for the children, but all the young people and even some of the older gentlemen greeted the idea with such enthusiasm that the scope of the game was quickly extended. And almost everyone who was not playing, all except the Dowager, Lady Irene, and Baron Bolton, in fact who retired for an afternoon nap, agreed to play the essential role of spectator. The men busied themselves setting up the pitch, while Kit divided the prospective players into teams of roughly equal ability and experience. Lauren, Gwendolen, and Daphne, meanwhile, spread blankets on the lawn for the spectators, a safe distance from the wickets. Several of the younger children dashed about, guessing under everyone's feet, tolerated only because the sun was shining, and soon their energies would be channeled into the game. In all the noise and bustle, no one noticed 3 riders approach up the driveway and onto the terrace until Daphne Willard hailed them. Lord Ranulph Bedwyn had already dismounted and was lifting Lady Freya to the ground. Lord Elaine was surveying the chaos before him. "Ah," he said, "a cricket match, I perceive, and not yet begun. Good afternoon, Mom." He addressed himself to the Countess, sweeping off his hat and inclining his head as he did so. Might one be permitted to join the fun, even though one came merely to pay one's respects? The Countess introduced them to Gwendolen, whom they had not yet met. Lord Ranulph bowed over her hand and retained it while he exchanged civilities with her. "You are quite sure you will not play?" he had asked, coming toward Lauren and grinning down at her. It seemed to her suddenly that last night could not possibly have happened. None of it. He looked so normal, so much his usual self. And she was very much her usual self. "Quite sure," she said firmly. "I would not have the smallest idea what to do." "You can catch a ball, surely," he coaxed. "You can run. I can teach you how to wield the bat." "Kit," she said, "if this is another of your ideas for forcing me to enjoy myself, you are going to forget it right now. I'm going to enjoy myself immensely sitting here. Besides, not one of the other ladies over the age of 18 is out there to make a spectacle of herself." But even as she spoke, Lady Freya Bedwyn strode out onto the lawn with Lord Elaine and announced her intention of playing on whichever side was not Kit's. Lord Elaine joined Kit's team. "There is no persuading you," he had laughed and turned his attention back to the cricket match, which was about to begin. Lauren adjusted her wide-brimmed straw hat to shade her complexion more effectively from the sun and permitted herself a sigh of relief. She had feared for one moment that he was going to insist. She needed to think. No, she did not. Not now. She felt color flood her cheeks at the memory of last night. She must not think about any of it until she was alone again, or of the fact that she had said no. God help her, she had said no. The cricket match was lively and merry. Kit, whose side was fielding first, did a great deal of yelling and laughing. He was bowling, and he was annoying some of the more serious members of his team by deliberately allowing the smaller, weaker players to score against him, while reserving his more lethal skills for the experienced players. When young David Clifford, standing at the wickets closest to him, his bat almost as big as himself, had to run the length of the pitch in order not to be thrown out by Sebastian Willard, a member of Eton's first 11 last term, Kit picked the child up bodily and ran with him, laughing gaily all the way. They raced the ball by perhaps half a second. Dear me. Thus far, Kit is the star of both teams, Lord Ranulph remarked. He must be inspired, like the knights of old, by the admiring eye of his lady. Do you wear his favour in your bosom by any chance, Miss Edgeworth? But we are about to see what he can accomplish against Freya. Crispin Butler, having just been bowled out, it was indeed Lady Freya who had come up to bat. Lauren had been very aware of her from the start, standing on the sidelines some distance from the blankets, with the rest of her team, bareheaded, a mane of unruly hair shining golden in the sun, smiling occasionally in the direction of the spectators, a challenge in her eyes as they met Lauren's. She was, of course, perfectly at her ease on the cricket pitch. She settled her bat before the wickets and squinted off in the direction of Kit, who was running into the far wickets to bowl to her. It was clear that he knew her to be an accomplished player. He bowled his best ball at her. She hit it for a 6. The ball arced up into the sky and landed way off on an undefended expanse of lawn. Benjamin went racing after it while the spectators applauded. The fielders groaned. Claude's team jumped up and down with loud, unrestrained glee, and Lady Freya hitched her riding habit with one hand and dashed between the wickets, laughing triumphantly, her hair streaming out behind her. Kit was laughing too. That was your free hit, he called to her. After this one, we get serious. Serious is not nearly good enough for me, she called back. Bring on a better bowler. Flushed, animated, and magnificent, she turned her head in the direction of the blankets again, and her eyes mocked Lauren's prim, ladylike presence. Ah, a gauntlet has been tossed down, Lord Ranulph murmured. This is quite like old times. Lady Freya blocked the next ball, and the wicket stood. She got a hit off the next one, a perfectly catchable hit, but it sailed in the direction of 4-year-old Sarah Bremont, who watched it come in evident dismay, clapped her hands together at just the wrong moment while her teammates screamed at her to catch it, and burst into tears as the ball thudded onto the grass at her feet. Lauren, 22 years her senior, knew just exactly how she felt. Kit trotted toward the child. That was a mishit, Freya. It was not Sarah's fault at all that she did not catch it. You had better hit it again. Someone threw the ball back to Lady Freya, and she tossed it up and hit it in a slow arc. Kit scooped up Sarah with one arm, cupped her little hands in his free one, and caught the ball. Out, he yelled, and all his teammates cheered wildly. Lady Freya made a fuss, a loud one, as did the rest of her team. She stood hands on hips, her bat dangling from one of them, her head thrown back, complaining that Kit was sly and conniving, while he laughed at her and accused her of being a poor sport. But it was perfectly clear to Lauren that there was nothing serious about the quarrel, that they were deliberately insulting each other for their team's amusement, that they were really enjoying themselves. They were a perfectly matched couple, in fact, as she had seen from the start. It was an undeniably depressing realization, not because she was in any way in competition with the lady, despite the mocking glance Lady Freya threw her way as she stalked off the field, apparently in high dudgeon, but merely because, again, Lauren knew that she never could be in competition, even if she wished to be. She had looks and breeding, yes, but she was completely lacking in that certain something that could win and hold a man's admiration and arouse his passion. Despite last night, when all was said and done, she was merely Lauren Edgeworth. Sarah, a moment of triumph over, came wandering toward the blankets, looking for her mother, who had already gone back indoors out of the heat. There were still tears on her cheeks. Lauren drew her handkerchiefs out of an inner pocket and dried the child's eyes. "That was a wonderful catch," she said. "Are you tired of cricket?" The child nodded. "Come and play," she invited. Lauren hesitated. She had been to the nursery a few times during the past few days and had been surprised to find that children seemed to take to her. But she had not been alone with any of them. "What would we do?" she asked. "Push me on the swing." Sarah had hold of her hand now and was tugging at it. "There is a swing?" She got to her feet. There was indeed. It was suspended on long ropes from a high branch of one of the great oak trees close to the parterre gardens. Lauren had not noticed it before. Sarah, who held her hand as they crossed the lawn, climbed on, and Lauren pushed her, at first tentatively and then higher at the child's urging. Sarah whooped with glee. "Higher!" Lauren laughed. "If you go too high," she said, "you will kick your way right through into the treetop land, and I will be left with an empty swing and no Sarah." And then she noticed that their progress across the lawn had not gone unobserved. Other small children, bored with cricket, were approaching and demanding their turn on the swing. Lauren was soon busy pushing the swing, making sure that everyone had an equal turn, helping the idle ones climb onto the lower limbs of the tree, jumping them down to the ground so that they could scramble up and do it all over again, and lassing with them. At least they were in the shade here, she thought gratefully, sheltered from the full force of the sun. "The swing goes to a magic land at the top of the tree," Sarah announced after a while. "Who says so?" Henry Butler demanded scornfully. "I say so." Lauren looked at him, all amazement. "You mean you have never heard of it? You did not know there is a magic land above swing?" "Tell us. Tell us." All 5 children took up the chant, and Lauren laughed again. Now what had she started? It was years since she had entertained herself and helped lull herself to sleep with stories in which little girls were never left behind by their mothers, in which life was always a vivid adventure, in which one could sail beyond the farthest horizon and always come back safely again, in which there was always a happy ending. She had never told such stories aloud, and yet there was a time when she had dreamed of doing so, of sitting on the side of her own child's bed, hers and Neville's, telling bedtime stories. "I am going to sit down here in the shade," she said, suiting action to words. "Gather around if you want to hear." The children sat on the ground and raised eager faces to her. The youngest, 3-year-old Anna Clifford, came and cuddled into the crook of her arm. Once, not so very long ago, she began to spin a tale of 2 young children, a boy and a girl, who had sat side by side on the swing and swung themselves so high that they had pushed aside the branches and the air and slipped between the curtains of the world straight through to the magic treetop land, which could not be seen from the ground and which was different in every possible way from the land below. The grass was different, and the houses and animals and people. It was a place of eye-popping novelty and hair-raising adventure and heart-pounding danger. "And then, in the nick of time," she said at last, as they all gazed at her spellbound, they spied the empty swing come soaring up through the red grass, and they climbed on quickly and clung to the ropes and each other's hand and came swooshing back down to the foot of the tree, where their mamma and papa were waiting anxiously for them. They were safe again and had such a story to tell. There was an audible sigh of satisfaction from the children. "Did they ever go back up?" Sarah asked. "Did they?" "Oh, yes, indeed," Lauren assured them. "Many times, added all sorts of exciting adventures. But those are stories for another time." "Ah," the children protested, while Lauren laughed and held Dana to her side. "Which we must all hope will come very soon." Lauren looked up to see Kit standing bareheaded out in the sunlight, still in his shirt sleeves, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked as if he must have been standing there for a while. The lawn behind him was deserted, she could see. The cricket match had ended without her noticing. He was smiling at her, a look of unmistakable affection in his eyes. Her stomach performed a complete somersault, or felt as if it did, and left her feeling slightly breathless. She recognized that it was desire she felt. She knew, too, in that moment, that it was more than just desire. It was knowledge. She knew that lie's handsome body. More, she knew the man inside. She knew him as a complex person who hid so much of himself away behind the surface gaiety. And yet the gaiety was real, too. It was not just a mask. "Everyone has rushed off to the lake for a swim," he said. "Is anyone here interested?" He grinned about at all the children who were on their feet and dashing off in the direction of the water, almost before he had finished speaking. "Not me," Lauren said hastily. He stood where he was, still smiling. "You continually surprise me," he said. "I did not know you were so wonderful with children." "Oh, I am not," she assured him. "I have never had anything to do with them." "Allow me to contradict you," he said. "You have been playing here for almost an hour with 5 toddlers. No easy task on such a hot afternoon. I observed no sign of any quarrel, despite the fact that there is only one swing, and there are always quarrels over it." "Has it been that long?" she asked. "And how do you know there were no quarrels?" "You have been playing cricket." "Oh, I know," he assured her, causing that strange somersaulting in her stomach again. He came closer and offered his hand to help her to her feet. "Where did the story come from? A book?" "No, of course not," she said with a laugh. "I made it up as I went along. It is not difficult to create a magic land in which anything can happen, and usually does." "I do believe," he said, "you have been enjoying yourself, and I cannot claim any credit for it." "Yes, you can," she said earnestly. "I would still be in London, kid, if you had not brought me here. I would still be fending off all the worthy gentlemen the Earl of Sutton and Wilmot consider eligible for me, and hating every moment." "They are a pair of prize idiots," he said. "They thoroughly deserve each other." She laughed again. "There are enough supervisors and to spare for the children at the lake," he said. "Let's play truant for an hour or two, Lauren." Is everyone swimming?" she asked. "The visitors too?" "I dare say," he grinned. "A little matter of propriety will not deter Freya, you may be sure. The other girls will doubtless follow her lead and give their mothers heart palpitations. But it is a hot day, and we all used up a great deal of energy playing cricket. Are you sure you would not rather be there with everyone else?" Lauren asked. He tipped his head to one side as she brushed grass and twigs from her skirt. "I think we should go somewhere quiet together," he said. "It is what everyone will expect of us, you know." "No." He held up one hand as she looked up at him. "Don't stop smiling. We are betrothed, and despite the firmness of your answer last night, we are going to be married, I believe. But we need not discuss that again yet. Play truant with me." Yearning his ha-ha'd low in the abdomen. Caution knocked on the door of her mind at the same moment. She had gone too far last night. She did not regret it in the obvious way. She had been unable in all the hours since to be morally shocked by what she had done. But she regretted it in another way. The femininity had been dragged out of hiding last night. She had given in to needs she had kept carefully locked inside herself before her wedding day and since. Needs she had ruthlessly denied. Needs she had always believed only Neville could satisfy. The need to be fully and openly a woman. She could very easily come to need Kit. She could very easily fall in love with him. It was a new and alarming possibility. She had never doubted until last night that she was a one-man woman, that she could never love any man but Neville. She could fall in love with Kate. But she must not allow herself to do so, for she was not at all the right woman for him. She was as different from Lady Freya Bedwyn as it was possible to be. Yet Lady Freya was so patently right for him. It was with her he had laughed and come vibrantly alive this afternoon. She must not fall in love. She must not risk having to cope again with the sort of heartbreak she had hardly expected to survive last year. Besides, she had promised him that she would release him from their engagement at the end of the summer. She could not break a promise, even though last night had changed things sufficiently that his honor would make him try to insist. She had not intended to trap him into marriage. She would not do it. What she had come here for was to have one small adventure, one brief fling of pleasure before settling down to her chosen future. And what she had found here so far was an adventure. She was enjoying herself. She wanted more. She wanted to drink this cup to the dregs, to the last wonderful moment before she must leave. "Just for an hour, then," she said, reaching out her hand for him to clasp in his own. And then, wondering why she had done something so uncharacteristic of her. There was instant connection, both physical and emotional. Walking hand in hand with a man was far more intimate, she discovered, than walking arm in arm, and more youthful, more joyous. 17. He knew exactly where he would take her. It involved walking beside the lake on the house side and passing all the children and youngsters and a few adults splashing and shrieking in the water, while others stood or sat on the bank watching. As he fully expected, Freya was in the water, swimming with strong strokes farther out than anyone else. Ralph was leaning indolently against a tree trunk, talking with Lady Muir. Both turned and lifted a hand in greeting. It was surprised to discover that he had no wish to jump in and frolic with everyone else, that he felt no urge to race Freya to some predetermined point. He had wondered, yes indeed he had, even after 2 visits to Lindsay Hall, even after the horse race, he had wondered if seeing her again would rekindle his passion for her. He had wondered it even this afternoon, when she had ridden up with Ralph and Alain and thrown all her considerable energy into playing cricket. He had wondered, even as he had known that now he must marry Lauren. But a strange thing had happened during the course of the match. He had thoroughly enjoyed the competition with Freya, the bantering challenges and exchange of insult. He had felt almost as if time had regressed, and he was a boy again, she a girl. He had felt for her all the exuberant camaraderie of old, with none of the madness that had gripped him during those dreadful weeks 3 years ago. He had enjoyed the cricket match, yet all the time as he concentrated on making the game fun for the children and challenging for his older cousins, he was aware of Lauren. He was aware of her sitting cool and ladylike on the blanket, pretty in her light muslin dress and straw bonnet, watching the game. He was aware of her the moment she got to her feet and was tugged off in the direction of the swing by Sarah. He was aware of her playing there with the child and attracting other little ones into her orbit. He'd been amazed by the tenderness of his feelings for her. He was not accustomed to feeling tenderness for women. He did not quite understand the feeling, yet he liked it. Perhaps he thought this was what women meant when they spoke of romance. Something warm and gentle and enticing. Perhaps he was involved in a romance with Lauren Edgeworth. Its first, though of course there was more to it than just that. There had been last night. "Are you sure you do not wish to swim with everyone else?" she asked him. "I do not mind if you do. You must not feel honor bound to remain with me. I am dull company for someone like you, I know." For someone so beautiful, and with such impeccable manners and breeding, she had a remarkably low image of herself. "Allow me to be the judge of that," he said, adjusting their clasped hands so that their fingers were laced. "Lauren, did Baron Galton make no attempt to learn of the fate of your mother? Did the late Earl of Kilbourne make none to discover what happened to his brother?" She shook her head. "How would it have been possible to discover anything?" she asked. "The world is a large place to search. The 2 members of the British aristocracy would not go unnoticed wherever they went. So there was no finality for any of you, he said. It does not matter. I do not think of it. A lie, if ever he had heard one. She was looking down at the grass over which they walked, a face hidden behind the wide brim of her straw bonnet. I have connections, you know, he said. Men whose business it is to uncover what is hidden, to learn what is seemingly impossible to know. I could call in a few favors. I could set an inquiry afoot. Shall I do it? She turned her head sharply then. Her eyes were wide and very deeply violet. You would do that, she asked, for me? Even though if there is anything to discover, it could not be done until long after we part? She had been quite adamant last night that she would not marry him, even though she had lain with him. Foolishly adamant, she might be with child. You have done a great deal for me, he said. Allow me to do something in return. Have I? She had stopped walking. Her eyes were brimming with tears. But I wish there did not have to be so much deception involved, kid. I liked your family so very much. Your mother, your grandmother, everyone. There is no need for any deception at all, he said gently. We could announce our wedding date at Grandmamma's birthday. Not an imaginary occasion, the real thing. She shook her head. Are you so irrevocably attached to him then? He asked. He was beginning to be irritated no end by the Earl of Kilbourne, though he had never met the man. She shook her head again. It was our bargain, she said. A way out of a tangle for you, freedom for me. Don't spoil everything, kid. All I wanted of the summer was a little adventure. It was rather lowering to know that she would not marry him simply because she did not wish to do so. But she had never pretended otherwise. He was the fool if he was allowing himself to be beguiled by a summer romance. He smiled at her and began walking again. You cannot blame a gentleman for having a conscience, he said. We will devote ourselves to the adventure then. You see that piece of land jutting into the lake up ahead? He pointed toward it. It is an island, actually. Man-made, of course, as is the lake. We will go there. There is a boat. Thank you, she said. He did not know for what he was being thanked, but he was content to stroll onward in companionable silence, and to look forward to relaxing on the island with her. The boat was still in its accustomed place, he discovered, when they arrived at the little boathouse, and it was in good repair. The pile of towels that had always been kept on a shelf was still there too, and they looked fresh and clean. He took 2 of them. He rowed the short distance across the water, while Lauren sat, relaxed and elegant, on the narrow bench opposite him, one hand on the side of the boat for balance. He helped her out on the other side and dragged the boat clear of the water. On the side of the island farthest from the house there was a wide bank, almost like a small meadow, sloping gently to the water's edge. It was grass-covered and carpeted with daisies and buttercups and clover. They waded ankle-deep through the wildflowers, and Lauren sat down in the midst of them, clasped her arms about her knees, and gazed about her. I was never really fond of the outdoors, she said with a contented sigh. But now you are. Yes. Her eyes squinted at the bright water. Kit did not sit down. It was a hot afternoon. He had engaged in an energetic game of cricket. They had walked some distance, and he had just rowed the boat across the lake. He peeled his shirt off over his head, dragged off his boots, and pulled off his pantaloons. He hesitated only a moment before removing his drawers, too. Lauren watched him lazily. Just a few days ago, he thought, she would have been bristling with embarrassment and outrage. You are very beautiful, she surprised him by saying. He chuckled. Despite all the scars? Yes, she said. He splashed into the water and immersed himself. It felt deliciously cool against his hot, naked flesh. He swam several strokes underwater and then surfaced and shook the drops from his eyes. She was still sitting among the flowers, as pretty as any picture, looking cool and unruffled, her face shaded by the wide brim of her bonnet. But she untied the ribbons beneath her chin even as he watched, and let the hat fall backwards to the grass while she shook out her dark curls. He had swum out beyond his depth. He trod water, his arms spread to the sides, watching her take off her shoes and stockings, and then get to her feet to unbutton and remove her dress. The schist clung to her slender curves. He gazed appreciatively at her, marveling that today there was none of the maidenly modesty that had had her undressing inside the Folly and then huddling under a blanket to the very water's edge on the 2 mornings they had bathed. And then his lips pursed in sudden shock as she crossed her arms and drew the shift off over her head before dropping it onto the small pile of her other clothing. Naked, she was perfection itself, usefully taut flesh and muscles, firm, up-tilted breasts, long, slender legs, dark hair at their apex. She came down the bank and waded into the water, her eyes on it rather than on him, though she made no attempt to cover herself. Her flesh was pure alabaster in the bright sunlight. He felt his mouth turn dry and moistened his lips before diving under again and surfacing beside her. He did not touch her. She did not touch him. They smiled at each other, and she closed her eyes and lay back on the water. She floated easily and kicked her feet lazily to propel herself backward. He swam a slow crawl at her side. Did she realize, he wondered, how much she had changed during the short time she had spent at Aldersley? How far she had stepped out from behind her ice-maiden mask? Lauren Edgeworth bathing naked in broad daylight with a naked man? Her friends and his would not believe it possible. Could it really be true that she wanted this for only a brief summer out of her life? That she would freely choose to return to her old self as soon as it was over? "If I try to put my feet down," she asked, turning her head to look at him after a few minutes, "will I be able to?" He gauged their distance from the bank. "Probably not," he said, "but don't be afraid. You will not sink unless you choose to do so, and I will rescue you even if you do." "I am not afraid," she said. "Kit, teach me to swim like that. Let me try again." He turned her over onto her front, his hands skimming sleek, cool flesh. It was as if she moved in that charmed magic world she had been spinning for the children. This afternoon she could put her face in the water without panicking and breathe without gulping in water instead of air. And today she could kick her feet close to the surface so that her efforts to move forward were not in vain. She learned the arm motions for a crawl in a trice. Within 10 minutes she was actually swimming, in water that was at least 8 feet deep. "At this speed," he said, swimming beside her, "you could probably make it across to the main bank in 24 hours. 23 if you did not stop for a rest halfway." "Mark on," she said breathlessly. She probably had more to say, but she needed all her breath and concentration for the task at hand. He turned her onto her back again after a while, and they floated side by side, her hand in his. He could not remember feeling so relaxed, so contented, so filled with a sense of well-being since, well, perhaps he had never felt this way. He closed his eyes and soaked up the warmth of the sun on his face and its brightness on his eyelids. "Some moments," he said, "should be made to last forever." She agreed. But the moments and the truant hour would pass all too quickly, of course. Although their status as a newly betrothed couple gave them much license to spend time alone together, there were limits. Soon enough they must return to the house and all the busy merriments of the house party. The air felt cool against wet flesh when they came out of the water and climbed the bank. Cool, but not cold. The heat of the sun would dry them in no time at all. He spread their towels on the grass and lay down on one. He expected that now she no longer had the water for cover, Lauren would wrap the towel about herself and perhaps sit a little apart from him, prim and self-conscious again. He half expected that she would dress as quickly as possible and want to return to the boat. But she lay down naked on the towel beside him, covered her eyes with one arm, and raised one leg to set her foot flat on the ground, an inviting pose that was undoubtedly unconscious. He turned his head and then raised himself on one elbow for a better look. All the mistresses he had ever had, and all the casual amours, had been voluptuously built. It was one criterion by which he had chosen them. Generous curves and full heavy breasts aroused him sexually, and of course mistresses were for sex. Lauren Edgeworth was slender and long-limbed. When she lay on her back, her breasts appeared even smaller than usual, though they were nicely shaped and rose-tipped. Her abdomen was flat. Her legs were slim and shapely. He felt a pleasurable tightening in his groin and realized with rueful humor that if she removed her arm from her eyes, she would surely understand her danger in a moment. She was without a doubt one of the loveliest women he had ever set eyes upon, but he had known that even as far back as Lady Mannering's ball, no farther back, in Hyde Park, despite the fact that he had had only one functioning eye, he had noticed and appreciated her extraordinary beauty. But she was more than beautiful. She was sexy. Was there such a word? If there was not, there should be. Without any of the obvious allure of a courtesan, her body nevertheless invited a man to sex, yet there was nothing erotic about either her body itself or her character. What was it? Was he the privileged witness to long-repressed womanhood blossoming forth into glorious femininity? Was he the instrument through which it was happening? Did he have that honor? He knew for certainty that she had never done anything remotely resembling this ever before. Even if he had been in any doubt of that fact, though he had not, he had encountered the proof of it last night. She had been a virgin. His eyes moved down her slim, quite unvoluptuous, sexy body. He desired her every bit as much as he had ever desired a woman, perhaps more. But she would not marry him. She did not want to. He must not. He had already endangered her once last night. He must not trap her into losing the freedom she clearly prized. He must not be that selfish, that undisciplined. She moved her arm away from her eyes and turned her head to smile up at him. "Kit," she said, her lovely eyes warm and dreamy, "this is what I meant at Vauxhall. Just this, though I did not even know it myself at the time. This, the sunlight on my face. I have never allowed it there before. It might ruin my complexion. The sounds of water and birds and insects, thousands of them chirping and droning away. Sometimes I forget that the world is alive. Sometimes I think there are only humans here, and maybe horses and cows and sheep, and the smell of water and grass and flowers. The flowers, Kid. They are weeds, daisies and clover and buttercups, but they are more lovely than anything else in the universe, and myself a part of it all. I have always been a spectator of life, you know, never a participant, never. But now I am. Today I am, and I am awed and deliriously happy. This is the adventure I asked for, the adventure I am having. I will be forever grateful to you." He swallowed, felt absurdly close to tears. He fought his arousal and hoped she had not noticed. She had spoken the simple truth. He could tell that just by looking into her eyes and seeing her as part of her surroundings. She was a part of it all, one with the sunshine and water, with the grass and flowers, with the birds and the chirping insect, like a wood nymph or a water nymph, like a sprite or a goddess. He knew beyond all doubt that this was one of life's precious moments, and that it would remain with him for the rest of his life. It was one treasure that his memory would hoard for future comfort. He must do nothing to spoil it. "Kid?" She reached up a hand and touched his cheek with light, cool fingertip. "Do what you did to me last night. I want it again, just one more time, here among the flowers, under the summer sun. It would be lovely here, would it not? If you want to, that is. Perhaps you do not." He leaned over her and set his lips to hers. She tasted of cool lake water and warm summertime. She tasted of innocence and awakened womanhood. She tasted of the enchanted land beyond the treetops. He ought to remind her of reality, of the fact that women were frequently impregnated during the act of sex, that pregnant women must marry their seducers even if they loved elsewhere, even if they craved freedom. But that enchanted land beckoned him too. Indeed, he was already immersed in it. in flower-dappled grass and clover fragrance and warm summer sunshine and bee song. This was what she had meant. This was what she had yearned for. Just this fleeting, magic moment, to be grasped or to be lost forever. He raised his head an inch or two above hers, and she smiled dreamily at him. He smiled back. Last night had been for him. He had poured out all his deepest pain to her, telling her Sid's story and his, and then he had reached out to her for physical comfort, which she had given generously, warmly, unstintingly, gifting him with her very self. This afternoon would be for her. He loved her slowly, with his hands and with his mouth, using all the expertise learned over the years with other women, but adapting it all just for her. She was not a woman of wild passion, not yet at least. She was a woman who needed tenderness and gentleness. He gave her both as his hands and mouth roamed her body, tethering, stroking, lightly scratching and pinching, licking, sucking, gently biting, choosing the erotic spots that would give her most pleasure. Her hands roamed his shoulders, his back, his chest, gently, inexpertly. He was accustomed to women who knew unerringly how to heighten and satisfy his passion. Lauren knew not a single one of their many tricks, but her very inexpertness brought him to full-blown, almost painful arousal. He loved her with almost desperate tenderness. He kissed her mouth with soft, deep kisses, looking warmly inside while the fingers of one of his hands explored the moist heat between her legs, passing fold, seeking, penetrating, feeling her muscles close about him. With his thumb he found the secret part of her womanhood and stroked her there until she whispered a surprised exhalation into his mouth and shuddered into a spasm of pleasure. "Do you want me inside?" he murmured to her. "Yes." She circled him with her arms. "Oh yes, do it to me like last night." Not quite like last night. The long grass and nodding flowers might give the appearance of a soft carpet, but they would make a hard mattress for a woman in the act of love. "Come." He lifted her over him and parted her legs to straddle his own. "Kneel up on the grass. Trust me." "Yes." She kneeled astride him and braced herself with her hands on either side of his head. She looked down at him and smiled, her eyes heavy with desire. He raised his knees and set his feet flat. He positioned her carefully, nestling himself against her opening before bracing his hands over her hip and guiding her down onto him. He watched her eyes close as she first frowned and then relaxed. Her muscles tightened about him as he held deep in her for a few moments to allow her time to adjust. She was hot and wet and exquisitely feminine. He drew a few steadying breaths. He was unaccustomed to having to impose control on himself after making his mount. It was the point at which, after long minutes of vigorous foreplay, he usually gave himself up to a frenzied climax. Except last night. But then last night had not really been about sex at all. Neither was this afternoon. This was not sex, not as he knew sex anyway. This was, what was it? A warm, intimate, tender sharing of what? He raised her a little with his hands and began to pump slowly, smoothly in and out of her. She held still, though her inner muscles picked up his rhythm, responded inexpertly at first, and then matched it. The sensation was delicious and painful both at once. He wanted to prolong the pleasure indefinitely. He wanted to give in and explode into her right now. Most of all, he wanted to give her all the pleasure 26 years of living had denied her. He wanted this to be for her, not for himself, but for Lauren. He wanted to see her totally, utterly happy. He stroked her with smooth, deep strokes for many minutes, not attempting to hasten the ending, as he might easily have done by touching her again in that small, secret place. He could see from her closed eyes and parsed lips and look of concentration that all her attention was focused in the passage that he worked, and that she was greatly enjoying the sensations. Perhaps that was all she would experience, but he would not shatter it until he could sense that she was ready. Then she found again, and her eyes clenched more tightly shut, and she drew her lower lip between her teeth. She laughed rhythm and tightened hard about him. She opened her mouth and gasped. "Relax now," he told her. "Relax those muscles and let yourself go." He tightened his hands over her hip and worked her with harder, faster thrusts. "Let it all come. Trust me." But there was no need for instruction, no need for him to coach her to climax. She cried out and shattered about him and collapsed her weight onto him. He wrapped both arms protectively about her. She was still pulsing and trembling. "Let it all go," he murmured against her ear. "Let it all come." He had never had to concern himself with feminine orgasms. He was usually too intent upon his own. She finally lay still and hot and damp on him. Now, finally, he was free to complete his own pleasure. He moved his hands back to her hips and braced his feet more firmly against the ground, and paused a moment, gritting his teeth. Then he lifted her off him and turned to set her gently on the towel beside him. The sound was a satisfied purr from deep in her throat as she rolled onto her side and curled in against him and promptly fell asleep. Kit lay back down and breathed deeply and evenly, clenching and unclenching his hand on the side farthest from her. Several minutes of sheer agony passed before his erection began to subside. He chuckled ruefully when the worst of it was over. In her innocence, she doubtless was quite unaware that she was the only one who had completed the act, as probably he had been last night. He might well have impregnated her last night, only time would tell, but if she'd escaped during that encounter, then she was still safe today. She would still have choices left when the house party ended. She would still be free to leave him. He set one arm over his eyes and sought and found her hand with his other. This must not happen again. They were not really betrothed, by her choice, and Lauren Edgeworth was not the sort of woman with whom one indulged in an illicit affair. Last night she had given to him in his need. This afternoon he had returned the favor. That was all. It was completed, this unexpected physical bond forged of both their needs. Yes, it was completed. He drew in a slow lungful of clover-fragrant air and let it out on an almost audible sigh. 18. The following morning presented Lauren with an opportunity to talk privately with Sydenham Butler, something she had not accomplished before. He was not often visible during the day, and during the evenings he invariably sat in the drawing-room window, his very posture discouraging company. She had no real wish to talk with him at all, but she had come here to help Kit be reconciled with his family. The deepest hers of all, she had discovered, 2 nights before, involved his younger brother. A number of the men and boys had gone fishing with Kit, Lauren's grandfather among them. Several of the ladies, including Gwen and Aunt Clara, had gone into the village to see the few shops and to view the Norman church. Lauren had stayed behind to wander among the flower beds and through the hothouses with the Countess and help her make final plans for decorations for the birthday. When that task was completed, she accompanied the Dowager on her morning walk to the rose arbor and back. Mr. Sydenham Butler was riding alone up the driveway, Lauren saw, as they slowly climbed the steps on their return to the house. He appeared to do it very well, considering the fact that he had only one arm. She felt very sorry for his disabilities, but she did not feel particularly kindly disposed to him. He had been unfair to Kit. The Dowager took the arm of her favorite footman, a stout, good-natured young man, for the climb up the stairs to her room. Lauren excused herself and went back outside. She hardly knew what she intended to do as she stood on the steps again, her eyes on the stables. Kit's brother came walking out onto the terrace a few moments later. He limped ever so slightly, she noticed, perhaps as a result of stiffness from his ride. The limp disappeared after a few steps. He hesitated for a moment when he noticed her, and then came onward. "Good morning, Miss Edgeworth," he said when he was close enough. He touched the brim of his hat with his whip. "Mr. Butler." She felt dislike and guilt. But why feel guilt merely because he was maimed? She did dislike him. He had consigned Kit to a sort of permanent hell for no good reason, yet Kit still loved him. He smiled his crooked smile when he came to the foot of the steps and would have gone on past. "Mr. Butler, will you walk with me?" Lauren asked. He looked at her in evident surprise. He drew breath, to offer some excuse, she guessed, but he closed his mouth again, bowed and turned to walk with her across the terrace and out onto the wide lawn on which the cricket match had been played the day before. "The weather is not quite as lovely as yesterday," he remarked. "No, there are some clouds today." She almost lost her courage, but their bargain aside, she was concerned about Kit. She cared about him. She cared for him, much too deeply for comfort. She clasped her arms behind her and drew breath. "Mr. Butler," she asked, "why will you not forgive him?" It did not occur to her that perhaps he would not know what she was talking about. "Ah," he said softly, "is that what he has told you? Poor Kit." "Is he mistaken then?" she frowned. He said nothing for a while as they strolled diagonally in the direction of the trees. Then he sighed. "It is far too complicated an issue," he said at last. "You need not concern yourself with any of it, Miss Edgeworth, and you need not fear that I will be here indefinitely to blight your happiness and Kit's. I will be leaving within the next month or so, I believe. I will be taking a post with the Duke of Bewcastle." "At the Steward?" she asked. "That upsets Kit, you know. He tells me you were not made for such a life, that you are an artist. He loves you. Do you not realize that?" He stopped walking and gazed at the grass ahead of them before turning his head and looking directly at her. Lauren was shockingly aware of how very handsome he had been, of how terribly disfigured he now was, but her dislike of him had not waned. "And you think I do not love him?" he asked her. "I think you cannot," she said, "or you would offer him some comfort. Do you believe he has not suffered just because he does not carry around your wounds?" He was angry then, furiously so, judging by the sudden hardness of his eye and tensing of his jaw and flaring of his nostrils. But he brought himself under control before he spoke again. "Yes, I believe he has suffered," he said curtly. He turned to look back at the house. "This walk was not a good idea, Miss Edgeworth, not unless we agree to talk about the weather. I liked you, very much indeed, though I realize the feeling is not mutual. You are kindness and patience itself with my grandmother. You are gracious and amiable with everyone else. You have an obvious affection for my brother. I wish you happiness, both of you, but I must leave. I doubt you will see much of me once I have gone. It will be best for everyone that way. Shall we return?" But she had heard more than his words alone conveyed. She had heard another sad and lonely soul, too far withdrawn into himself for happiness. Kit, for all his deep misery, had found an audience in her 2 evenings ago, and some comfort. In whom did Sydenham Butler confide his deepest griefs? Was there anyone? He seemed such a very solitary figure. "There is one thing I am good at," she told him, ignoring his gesture back in the direction of the house. "I am good at listening, really listening, instead of hearing only what I want or expect to hear. Tell me what happened. Tell me your version of what happened." Kit had told her facts. She did not believe he had lied or tried in any way to mislead her. But sometimes even facts did not tell the complete story. Sometimes there were unconscious omissions or shadings that could change the whole perspective on an event. Get 3 people to tell what had happened on some tumultuous occasion, a wedding at Newbury, for example, and the chances were that one would get 3 similar but essentially different stories. He looked steadily into her eyes for a few moments before turning to continue their stroll away from the house. "Yes, I was the artist," he said, "the dreamer, the little brother who was small for his age until he shot up to a gangly height at the age of 15. I wonder if Kit has ever noted that I grew taller than he. Jerome was the solid one, the responsible one, the one who would inherit and be Earl one day. He was confident, active, strong. Kit was the mischief maker, the daredevil, the one at the center of any trouble, the one most often summoned to our father's library. He was the charismatic one, the bright, laughing one, my boyhood hero. I adored him. Lauren said nothing. A largish cloud had just moved off the face of the sun, and there was a flood of welcome brightness and warmth. I was everyone's favorite, he said. Sweet little Sid, the gentle dreamer, the one to be protected against all danger, all potential enemies, all punishments. He chuckled suddenly, and Lauren realized that he had almost forgotten her presence. One time when I took the boat out and did not secure it properly on my return, so that it drifted off into the middle of the lake, even taking it out unsupervised was strictly forbidden, you must understand, Kit confessed to the misdemeanor and was caned. Then, after I had heard about it, and insisted upon telling the truth, and was feeling rather proud of my own stinging rear, Kit got caned again for lying. They both did it, Jerome and Kit. They were forever protecting me, but I was a dreamer, you see, not a weakling. They were overprotective? Lauren asked. Yes. They had reached the little stream that bubbled over its uneven stony bed on its way to join the river. They turned to walk beside it. Because they loved me, of course. Love can be an infernal nuisance, Miss Edgeworth. Did you know that? It was a rhetorical question. She did not attempt to answer it. I wanted so desperately to be like Kit, he said. Self-knowledge is far more slowly learned than any of one's other lessons. Indeed, some people never come close to learning it, and perhaps none of us fully succeeds. I suppose the boat episode must have been an attempt on my part to be as bold as he. My insistence upon becoming a military officer was another. It was utterly foolish. I was not, of course, cut out for such a life. But I had something to prove, to Kit and my family, most of all to myself. And it ended badly, Lauren said. I'm very sorry about that, but it was not really Kit's fault, was it? He did not insist but you purchase a commission. He actively tried to prevent you from joining him on that disastrous spying mission, and his promise to protect you was unrealistic. Of course it was not his fault, he said fiercely. Lauren looked curiously at his perfect left profile. Why then, she asked him, do you refuse to forgive him? There is not even anything to forgive, is there? He made the right decision, didn't he? He looked angry again. They walked onward, while Lauren listened to the brook and looked across it to the path of the wilderness walk, just visible among the trees opposite. I owed obedience to officers of superior rank, he said at last. At that time I was a lieutenant, while Kit was a major, 2 ranks above me. He was my superior. More than that, on that particular mission he was my commanding officer. Had he ordered me to stay and be captured, I would have obeyed him without question. He did not so order. I volunteered. Did he tell you that? No, she said after a brief silent moment. He did tell me that you were the one to spot the possibility of escape for one of you. He never ordered me to do it, Sydenham said. I volunteered. He was horribly silent, wasting precious moments after I had suggested it, knowing very well as a loyal officer himself that there was no alternative. But he could not bring himself to give the order. I volunteered again. I insisted. And then I hugged him and I ordered him, a superior officer, to get out of there. I chose to stay, even though he would have ordered me to do so eventually, because duty must come before a brother, you will understand. I would not burden him with having to do it. I volunteered. Then why? Lauren frowned. Why? Kit will have told you that I was tortured, he said. I will not horrify you with any of the details, Miss Edgeworth. I hope he has not. I will say only this. For days and days on end, death seems the most attractive, desirable gift ever dangled before my eyes. I could have grasped that gift at any moment for the price of a little information. I did not do so because I was an officer, because it was my duty to keep silent. I did not break because I was capable of not breaking. I surprised even myself, because hell could not possibly be worse than... Pardon me. Eventually I knew, beyond a certain point, I knew that I would have the strength of will to die the hard way. I knew it, and a part of me exulted in the knowledge. I was so very proud of myself. He laughed softly, and then Kit and a gang of partisans rescued me. Lauren understood suddenly. He did not need to complete his story. She understood. But having begun it, he needed to tell it. They had come to the junction of the stream and the river, and had stopped walking. Lauren gazed off into the deer forest beyond and waited. Again, I was poor Sid, he said. I went through amputation and other painful procedures. I went through the delirium of fever and the ordeal of the voyage home. And all the time I was poor Sid. I arrived home, and Kit took all the blame on himself. I was just poor Sid, who should not have been allowed to go in the first place. I was poor Sid, whom my brother had failed to protect. Kit came very close to madness that summer, because he had sacrificed his young brother, because he could not take the wounds and the sufferings of poor Sid upon himself. Pardon me for being bitter. I could not make any of them understand. I gave up trying. They would not simply rejoice with you? Lauren asked quietly. He looked at her sharply. You do understand? She nodded, and her eyes filled with tears, something that seems to be happening to her rather too often these days. Yes, I understand. She set one hand tentatively on his arm, and then stretched up to place one gentle kiss against his good cheek. She hesitated only a moment before kissing his withered, purple-skinned white cheek as well. You were every bit as much a part of the success of that mission as Kit was. No, you were the greater part, because your role was so much more dangerous and painful and lonely. There is nothing sad or pathetic about you, Sydenham Butler. You are a great hero, and I honor you. His grin was lopsided and rather sheepish. Yes, indeed, she said severely. Love can be an abomination when it insists upon wrapping the loved one in cotton wool, when it will not trust the strength of the one it loves. I am quite sure you have made yourself into the world's most competent steward. They laughed together and turned to walk back to the house. You are going to have to talk to Kit, you know, she said as they approached the terrace, even if you have to tie him down and gag him. I think not, he said, though he chuckled at her words. Please, she begged softly. End of Side 6.